You already checked out of this conversation, and it hasn't even started yet. You're in a room, or on a call, or at a dinner table, and someone is talking. They're talking
Friends,
about
we
the
must
weather,
unite in purpose.
or about
But the
how
risks are
busy
great.
they've been,
Greater is
or
the
about a
peril
show
of
you haven't
inaction.
watched, and you can feel it. That specific internal stillness, that slight narrowing of attention, that quiet but unmistakable sense that what's happening right now is not worth the energy it cost you to perform engagement. You nod, you make the sounds, you generate the expected responses, and the whole time, something in you is somewhere else entirely. You've been told this is a problem. You've been told you're difficult to talk to. You've been called aloof, or arrogant, or socially awkward. Someone close to you at some point told you that you make people feel unwelcome, that you don't try hard enough, that normal people don't find basic conversation this exhausting. The word they reach for, the one that gets applied to people like you, is antisocial. Don't heed that word is wrong. And by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why. And more importantly, you'll understand what it would mean to replace it with the accurate one. This didn't start recently. Cast it back far enough, and you can find the original moment. The first time you understood that the way your mind engaged with conversation was going to be a social liability. Maybe it was a classroom where everyone else seemed perfectly comfortable filling silence with nothing, and you sat there genuinely confused by what the function of that was. Maybe it was a family gathering where you kept drifting toward the corner, not because you were shy, but because the conversations happening in the center of the room felt like static. Maybe it was the first party you attended where you expected something to actually happen between people, and instead watched everyone carefully perform connection without producing any. You went home those nights not relieved to be alone, but quietly disappointed. Something was supposed to happen, and it didn't, and you couldn't explain why you were the only one who seemed to notice. That confusion followed you. Into school, where teachers called you reserved. Into friendships, where people complained that you were hard to reach. Into workplaces, where small talk before meetings felt like an obstacle course you had to navigate before the actual point was allowed to begin. Into relationships, where your person would sometimes say, "You never just talk to me," and you couldn't make them understand that what they called just talking registered to you as noise with no information density, not conversation. Here's the internal monologue. You know this one. You walk into a social setting and someone opens with, "So how's everything going?" And immediately, without wanting to, you register the question as unanswerable. Not because you don't have an answer, but because the real answer is too dense for this context. And the expected answer, good, busy, you know how it is, feels like lying. So you deliver the expected answer and you feel the slight wrongness of it. And then they say something about the traffic or the weekend, and you track that too. And you say the thing back, and the whole exchange takes 45 seconds and produces nothing you will remember by tomorrow. You try to redirect. You ask a real question, something that interests you, something that might actually go somewhere. And you watch the other person's face shift slightly, recalibrate, sometimes deflect. They're not cruel about it. They just weren't looking for that. They wanted to skim, and you wanted to dive, and neither of you is wrong about what you want, but only one of you is going to leave the conversation feeling like something was wasted. So you stop redirecting. You learn to skim. You get good enough at it that most people don't even notice you performing. Don't notice that the version of you that shows up to casual social spaces is running on a fraction of actual engagement, like a program running in low-power mode. You produce the outputs. You ask about the kids, comment on the game, laugh at the right moments, and underneath all of it, you are so far from present it borders on an out-of-body experience. And here's the real question that all of this is actually asking. Not, am I normal? That's the surface question. The real question, the one you've been sitting with for years without quite being able to name it, is this: if genuine connection is what I'm wired for, Why does the world keep offering me substitutes and expecting me to be grateful? That is not a rhetorical question. It has an answer. And the answer starts with understanding what exactly is actually happening in your nervous system when small talk begins. Point 1. Dismantle the label. The word antisocial means something specific in psychology. It means a pattern of behavior characterized by disregard for others, manipulation, the inability to form genuine bonds. It is, clinically, the opposite of what you are. Antisocial people find people easy to read, easy to perform for. They are extraordinarily socially fluid because they have no authentic self getting in the way of whatever self the situation requires. You are the opposite of that. You find shallow interaction difficult, precisely because you have too much authentic self to suppress for the performance. The friction you feel in small talk is not the friction of someone who doesn't care about other people. It is the friction of someone who cares so specifically about real contact with other people that its absence registers as a kind of static. Antisocial is not the word. The word is selective. You are not refusing connection. You are refusing the counterfeit version of it. Those are not the same thing, and every time you let the wrong word stand unchallenged, you accept a verdict that was never based on accurate evidence. Point 2. The real psychological origin. Here's what is actually happening when small talk drains you. The brain processes conversation along multiple parallel tracks simultaneously. Semantic content, emotional tone, social signaling, narrative coherence. For most people, those tracks operate with roughly equal weight. When the semantic content is thin, as it is in most small talk, the other tracks compensate. Social signaling alone can feel rewarding. The warmth of shared presence, the ritual of acknowledgement, the simple pleasure of being recognized by another human. These are enough. For a subset of people, the semantic track carries disproportionate weight. The brain is not satisfied by warmth and ritual if there is nothing substantive being communicated. It keeps searching the conversation for the actual payload, for the idea, the revelation, the real thing the other person thinks or feels or believes, and when it doesn't find it, it registers the interaction as incomplete, not unpleasant necessarily, just unfinished, like a sentence that trails off before the point. This is not a deficit. This is a calibration. Your brain is tuned to a specific kind of signal, and it is very good at detecting when that signal is absent. The exhaustion you feel after an hour of surface-level conversation is not social anxiety. It is the cognitive cost of sustained processing of low information input, the same kind of tired you get from reading 100 pages of a book that says nothing. Your brain worked hard. It found nothing, and it is correctly reporting that the work was not worth what it returned. You were not wired wrong. You were wired for depth, and then placed repeatedly in shallow water and told to swim. The problem was never your wiring. Point 3. What the judgment reveals. The people who have told you that you're difficult, or aloof, or that you don't try hard enough, consider what they are actually communicating when they say that. They are telling you that they are comfortable in environments where genuine depth is not required. That surface-level exchange is satisfying enough for them that your visible dissatisfaction with it reads as a personal rejection. And here is the thing about that. They are not wrong to find small talk satisfying. That is a completely legitimate way to be wired. But the judgment in their assessment, the implication that there is something wrong with you for not sharing it, reveals an assumption they have never examined. That the way they are calibrated is the default, and everything that deviates from it is a malfunction. That assumption is not a neutral observation. It is a bias. A very common one, because people who find small talk easy are more numerous than people who don't, and majority. Why experience has a way of presenting itself as universal truth. But common is not the same as correct, and the person who finds small talk easy has never had to explain their preference, has never been called too social or too easily satisfied with surface-level connection, because their calibration happened to match the dominant expectation. Their judgment tells you nothing about your actual character. It tells you only that they have never been required to question whether their standard was ever universal to begin with. Point 4. The concrete advantage. When the trait that makes small talk exhausting is not suppressed. When it is acknowledged and allowed to operate in the right conditions, it produces something that most people cannot manufacture: real presence. In a conversation that actually matters, you are fully there. Not performing engagement, actually engaging. The same calibration that makes you restless in shallow conversation makes you extraordinarily attentive in deep ones. You track what people mean, not just what they say. You notice the sentence they almost completed but didn't. You hold the shape of a conversation across time and return to its real core when it drifts. You are the person that other people, the right other people, describe afterward by saying, "I've never talked to anyone like that. I felt actually heard." That is not a small thing. In a world where most people are half present in most conversations, a person who can be genuinely present in the ones that count is rare and valuable and sought after by the people who know what they're looking for. The disadvantage of your calibration is that it makes you exhausted in low-depth environments. The advantage is that it makes you extraordinary in high-depth ones. That is the trade. Both sides of it are real, but only one side has been named to you repeatedly as a problem. Point 5. Misused versus used. There is a version of this trait that becomes a liability. It happens when the trait is suppressed long enough that it turns into resentment, when the exhaustion of performing small talk cumulatively produces a contempt for the people who find it easy, a kind of sourness that leaks into how you move through social spaces, a withholding that goes beyond preference and becomes a refusal. That is the trait misused. That is what happens when you spend years being told your calibration is wrong, internalizing a shame you never deserved, and compensating by going cold. The trait in use looks different. It looks like knowing clearly which environments suit you and choosing them without apology. It looks like the ability to be genuinely warm in conversations that have substance and genuinely present with people who bring it. It looks like not faking engagement in small talk, but also not making other people feel judged for enjoying it. It looks like understanding the difference between what you need and what you owe, and honoring both without collapsing either into the other. The trait is not the problem. The suppression of it is, and every time you suppress it because someone told you it was rude or arrogant or difficult, you pay a cost that you were never supposed to pay for a crime you never actually committed. The first thing that has to change is the language you use internally when this trait surfaces. The current language, the words you reach for when you notice you're drifting out of a conversation, or when someone calls you difficult, or when you leave a social event more depleted than you arrived, is probably something like, "I'm bad at this, or "I should try harder," or the quieter version, the one that sounds reasonable but carries a full freight of shame. "I just don't connect well with people." That language is clinically inaccurate and practically harmful. Replace it. The replacement is not a positive affirmation. It is a more precise description of what is actually happening. The new internal language is, "This environment is low bandwidth for how my mind processes connection. I am not failing at this conversation. I am accurately reading that this conversation is not producing what my brain is calibrated to need. The cost I'm paying right now is real. It is also situational. It is not a verdict on my capacity for connection." 2. That is not a mantra. It is not comfort. It is precision. Precision matters because the damage that has been done to you by the wrong language is not emotional. It is cognitive. You built a model of yourself as deficient at something you are not actually deficient at. Replacing that model requires accurate language, not kind language. Kindness without accuracy is just a different kind of distortion. Most of the environments that have told you your trait is a problem are not environments you chose. They were given to you. School family gatherings, workplace social structures, parties thrown by people whose idea of connection is different from yours. The exhaustion you've accumulated is partly the cost of spending years in environments calibrated for a different mind. The audit is this: take an honest inventory of the environments in your current life and ask, for each one, whether it allows your trait to function or whether it suppresses it. Environments where your trait functions well share some characteristics. Conversations have actual stakes, ideas being worked through, problems being solved, real experiences being processed. The people in them are curious rather than performative. Depth is not treated as a social liability. You are allowed to be quiet when you have nothing worth saying, and your silence is not interpreted as hostility. Environments that suppress your trait have the inverse characteristics. Social performance is the primary currency. Depth is treated as intensity, and intensity is treated as a social problem. You are expected to produce warmth on demand regardless of whether the conditions for genuine warmth are present. The audit is not about eliminating every low-bandwidth environment from your life that is neither possible nor fully desirable. Some low-bandwidth environments come with people or obligations you value. The audit is about being clear-eyed about what each environment costs you so that you stop interpreting the cost as a character flaw and start managing it as a practical reality. You don't shame yourself for being tired after a long run. You plan around the recovery. Apply the same logic here the next time someone tells you that you're difficult to talk to, or that you don't try hard enough, or that you make people feel unwelcome. You need a 2-sentence internal response ready, because in the moment, the old language will try to come back. Here it is. First sentence: this person is reading my calibration through their own standard and finding it lacking by comparison. Second sentence: that comparison is not an objective measurement. It is a preference wearing the mask of a verdict. Lady, you do not have to say those sentences aloud. You do not have to explain yourself or defend yourself or correct the other person's perception. The protocol is for you. It is the internal pivot that keeps the judgment from landing as fact. You hear the assessment. You note where it comes from. You decline to absorb it as truth. That's all. 2 sentences, and then you continue. The final shift is the most structural one, and it is not about a technique or a response protocol. It is about a posture. Ownership is not pride. Pride is performed outward. Pride says, my way of being is better. Ownership is internal. Ownership says, my way of being is mine. It is accurate to how I'm actually built, and I am no longer spending energy pretending otherwise. The person who has reached ownership of this trait does not explain themselves in social situations, not because they are withholding, but because they no longer feel that their way of engaging requires justification. They are warm when warmth is genuine. They are quiet when nothing worth saying has arrived. They enter conversations without the ambient guilt of someone who expects to fail at them. They leave conversations that aren't working without the residual shame of someone who believes the failure was theirs. They have stopped converting the question, what's wrong with me, into an ongoing investigation. The investigation is closed. The finding was nothing. The trait is real. The environments were wrong for it. The language was wrong for it. The standard was wrong for it. The trait itself was never the problem, and the person who has reached ownership knows this not as a consolation, but as a settled fact. That is the posture. You don't arrive at it by being told you're fine. You arrive at it by understanding, with enough precision and enough evidence, that the verdict against you was never based on an accurate assessment of what you actually are. There is a larger pattern underneath all of this, and it is worth naming plainly. You have been, for most of your life, measuring yourself against a social standard that was built by and for people whose minds work differently than yours. The standard says ease in small talk is normal, Therefore, difficulty with small talk is abnormal. The standard says, finding shallow conversation satisfying is the baseline. Therefore, finding it insufficient is a deviation. The standard says, social fluency means producing warmth and engagement on demand in any context. And if you cannot do that, is something in you is lacking. That standard was never designed with your architecture in mind. It was not designed maliciously. It was designed by the majority, for the majority, because that is how standards get designed. But the thing about a standard that wasn't built for you is that failing to meet it tells you nothing about your actual capabilities. It tells you only that the measurement instrument was the wrong one. Here is what is actually true about you right now, stated as plainly as it can be. You are not deficient at connection. You are calibrated for a specific kind of it, and that kind requires more from a conversation than most conversations are willing to offer. You have spent years apologizing for a hunger that is not excessive. It is just precise. You have spent years performing a version of engagement that costs you more than it costs the people around you, because your brain is doing something different in those exchanges than theirs are. You have internalized a shame that belongs to a misdiagnosis, not to the actual condition. The condition is this: you are built for depth, not metaphorically. Neurologically, the way your brain weights semantic content, the way it tracks the real shape of what's being communicated beneath the words, the way it stays alert for the moment a conversation might become real. These are not bugs. They are the signature of a particular kind of mind, operating exactly as it was designed to. The final reframe is not about small talk. It was never about small talk. Small talk was just the surface symptom of a deeper truth about how you are built to engage with the world, which is carefully, specifically, and with your entire attention reserved for what actually deserves it. You were not being difficult. You were being precise.